Take your time, we're fine. Kind of laid-back committee this morning. The committee will come to order and the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Today we are reviewing Senate Bill 611, the Grassroots Rural and Small Community Water Systems Assistance Act. This bill, which passed the Senate by unanimous consent on June 9th of this year, is the Senate companion to H.R. 2853, introduced by our ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, and the vice chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Harper. I congratulate and thank them for their bipartisan work to raise the profile of this issue before the subcommittee and encouraging our work on it. According to the Census Bureau, approximately 27% of the U.S. population lives in rural areas. The smallest water systems account for 77% of all systems. As someone who probably represents communities in small town and rural America, I am glad we have bipartisan interest in tackling this subject. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, small and rural drinking water supply systems are subject to a number of drinking water regulations issued by EPA. These requirements include system monitoring, treatment to remove certain contaminants, and reporting. Addressing these matters requires technical, managerial, and physical capabilities that are difficult to develop and are often beyond the capacity of these towns to afford on the same scale as urban centers, particularly when it comes to regulatory compliance. It's ironic that these communities, where residents work hard to support their families and their local governments, while often earning wages below those of their counterparts in the more urbanized areas, face per-customer compliance costs and demands that are disproportionate to many larger communities. Sometimes it's just a matter of having the ability to keep up with the red tape. Rather than throwing more scarce money at the problem, we learned in February that these communities need help to smartly assess what their needs are for these systems and prioritize the importance of those needs. The bill before us amends the Safe Drinking Water Act to reauthorize the EPA's program providing technical assistance to small public water systems. Senate Bill 611 maintains the existing statutory authority of a $15 million annually, including a 3% for technical assistance to public water systems owned or operated by Indian tribes, but changes the law to cover funding from fiscal year 2015 through fiscal year 2020. The bill also authorizes EPA to provide technical assistance programs to small public water systems through grants or cooperative agreements made to nonprofit organizations. The bill requires preference in awarding grants to nonprofits that are most qualified and experienced and that small water systems find most beneficial and effective, a feature we heard about during our February hearing. Finally, while Senate Bill 611 prevents grants and cooperative agreements from being used to bring a citizen suit under the Safe Drinking Water Act, it expands the types of activities eligible to receive a grant or cooperative agreement under the Safe Drinking Water Act to include assistance with source water protection plans, monitoring plans, and water security. I want to thank our witnesses who joined us. Having this hearing today is all the more important because while the House Appropriations Committee has not provided small water technical assistance funding for fiscal year 2016, that committee has left open the option that it will reevaluate funding for this matter as part of a later annual spending bill if Congress enacts a fresh authorization. People who live in rural communities deserve every bit of water quality and technical assistance that folks who live in densely populated urban centers do. We look forward to your wisdom in helping us understand these issues. Thanks again to Mr. Tonko and Mr. Harper for their work on this issue. I yield back the balance of my time, and I now yield to Mr. Tonko for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Shimkus, and good morning. For holding this hearing, we thank you. It's important to review the Grassroots Rural and Small Community Water Systems Assistance Act. I'm very pleased to be working with you, Chair, and with Representative Harper and the other members of the subcommittee to move this bill forward. Senator Wicker's bill and its companion, H.R. 2853, offers a small but important step that we need to take to support small water utilities. S611 reauthorizes a small but important program that delivers technical assistance and training to community water systems. The ratepayer base for these small systems does not provide a sufficient operating budget to support full-time technical positions. Technical assistance programs like circuit riders and source water protection programs help small utility operators to keep clean, safe drinking water flowing to their customers. Our community water utilities have needs that go far beyond technical assistance, of course. The hearing in our subcommittee back in February provided us with ample evidence of the many needs of small community water utilities. The situation that exists in rural, suburban, and metropolitan areas across our country with respect to the condition of our drinking water infrastructure is indeed very serious. Drinking water infrastructure across the country is in need of major repairs and major upgrades. Communities are struggling to find the resources needed to maintain water mains, pumping stations, and drinking water treatment facilities. Households and businesses across our country expect reliable, daily delivery of safe, clean water at an affordable price to their homes and their businesses. They not only expect it, it is essential to the social and economic viability of every community, of every household, of every business. The inconvenience, the disruption of daily activities, and economic losses to businesses, of emergency shutdowns to drinking water systems is indeed significant, even for a shutdown of short duration. A longer-term break in service, as we all know, is devastating. Water utilities, especially those with small rate bases, cannot simply pass all of their costs for technical assistance, infrastructure repairs, tapping into new water sources, or keeping pace with drinking water regulations on to their customers by raising rates. The backlog of maintenance is now too large to be covered by rate increases alone. It is long past time for Congress to step in and provide robust financial support that would repair and modernize this essential infrastructure. Too often now, utilities are responding to emergency situations created by ruptures of water mains or sudden problems with raw water quality or quantity. Emergency response costs far more than a systematic planned program of repair and replacement. The Environmental Protection Agency's most recent report on drinking water infrastructure and their needs indicates that an investment of $384.2 billion over the next 20 years, about $19 billion, that is, per year. Because past Congresses failed to heed the information that we asked the agency to produce, this number has grown by about $157 billion since the first report was issued back in 1995. We are headed in the wrong direction. Clearly, more resources are needed. We are not saving money by continuing to ignore this problem. We're only passing an ever-growing maintenance bill on to our children and grandchildren and generations yet unborn. Our parents and grandparents invested in the infrastructure that enabled our nation to grow and our nation to prosper. We have a responsibility to ensure that the nation's infrastructure remains a strong foundation for prosperity into the future. In addition to support through traditional funding mechanisms, the state revolving loan fund and grant programs, we should also examine alternative financing mechanisms, new technologies, and potential new partnerships that would enable every dollar to go that much further in reducing the backlog of infrastructure projects. We cannot afford to delay these investments any longer. The bill for these repairs is growing larger over time, and failure to maintain these systems jeopardizes public health and limits development and economic growth. Public health, community viability, and economic vitality all rest on the foundation of sound infrastructure. We cannot maintain global leadership and compete in a 21st century global economy with poorly maintained 20th century infrastructure. And so, Mr. Chair, I hope this bill will not be the subcommittee's last effort on drinking water this Congress. I am certain that other members hear about this problem in their districts as often as you and I do. If we work together, we can rebuild this essential infrastructure and foster economic growth and protect public health. We have an excellent panel with us today, and I thank you both for taking time away from the important work that you do to be here with us this morning. With that, I look forward to your testimony and to working with you going forward. Let's build our drinking water infrastructure. With that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields back to the chair now recognizes the vice chair of the committee and the co-author, along with the ranking member of the House version of this legislation, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. and thank you so much as our witnesses being here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this legislative hearing on S611, the Grassroots Rural and Small Community Water System Assistance Act. As you well know, this issue is of great importance to our constituents who live in rural and small communities. Rural water systems often find themselves at a loss when complying with federal rules and regulations, and the technical assistance provided by S611 is the tool they use to ensure they are meeting the needs of their customers. I appreciate the work Mr. Tonko and his staff have done on this issue and for his help in introducing H.R. 2853, the House companion bill to S611. I also would like to welcome my friend Kirby Mayfield, the Executive Director of the Mississippi Rural Water Association, and I look forward to hearing today from each of these witnesses and working on these rural water issues in the future. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm pleased that the subcommittee is returning to the important issue of drinking water safety. We started this Congress by examining some emerging drinking water threats, including toxic blue-green algae, and the legislation this subcommittee passed on harmful algal blooms is now taking effect, and it has set us on a path to address that serious threat. We also held a hearing back in February on problems facing rural water systems. As we heard then, these systems are facing serious threats from outdated infrastructure, lack of funding, and extreme weather. We in Congress have continued to underfund infrastructure improvements and have continued to undermine efforts to address climate change, so we should expect these problems to get worse before they get better. Resources are central to any conversation about safe drinking water. Much of our nation's drinking water infrastructure is well beyond its useful life and in desperate need of replacement. Investing in drinking water infrastructure protects public health, creates jobs, and boosts the economy. It's imperative that this subcommittee take on the important task of reauthorizing the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. The longer we put off drinking water repairs, the more pressing the public health threats become. But the subcommittee is not tackling that important task today. Instead, the majority is focused on a small pot of money set aside for technical assistance for small public water systems. This money, distributed through grantees, including the National Rural Water Association and the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, has been important for small systems, though it does not begin to close the infrastructure funding gap that they face. Both NRWA and RCAP will be represented on the panel today, and I look forward to hearing from them about how this program can be implemented to the greatest benefit for small systems and public health. I expect the committee and probably the House will move this legislation. It will be signed by the President. That's a good step, and I welcome it. But it's not the whole solution for small systems or for our drinking water infrastructure. Small systems serve only 8% of the population. We should absolutely do what is necessary to ensure they have safe water, but we should also protect the other 92%. And that means reauthorizing the SRF, ensuring that fracking is done safely, ensuring source water protection, addressing drought, and planning for climate change. Unlike the algae bill we worked on earlier this year, this bill shows that we can come together to pass laws and address drinking water issues. So I hope my Republican colleagues will see this only as the beginning. And I thank the chairman for calling this hearing, particularly thank the ranking member of our subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for his leadership on drinking water issues. I don't know if anybody else wants my time. If not, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back his time. Again, welcome. Your full statement is submitted for the record. You'll have 5 minutes. We're not going to be, harsh on the time, but we appreciate you coming and making the effort to be here. So first I'd like to recognize Mr. Kirby Mayfield, Executive Director of the Mississippi Rural Water Association. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the subcommittee. I am Kirby Mayfield, the Executive Director of Mississippi Rural Water Association, a nonprofit association of over 1,000 small rural communities as members. All small and rural communities have the very important public responsibility of complying with all federal water regulations and for supplying the public with safe drinking water and sanitation every second of every day. Small and rural communities often have difficulty providing safe, affordable drinking water and sanitation due to limited economies of scale and lack of technical experience. I am very proud that our Congressman on the committee, Representative Greg Harper, Harper is sponsor of the Grassroots Rural and Small Community Water Systems Assistance Act in the House of Representatives. Thank you very much, Congressman Harper. Attached to my written testimony is a letter from the New York Rural Water Association to Representative Tunko, stating, on behalf of all the rural and small communities in the 20th Congressional District in the state of New York, we are grateful to Congressman Tunko for being the original co-sponsor of the Grassroots Rural Water and Small Community Water Systems Assistance Acts and for your continued assistance. Mr. Chairman, I used to be a rural water circuit rider for over a decade back in Mississippi. As a circuit rider, is a water operations and compliance assistance technician who travels the state to be available on site and immediately to any small community that has water issues. The circuit rider concept was designed and funded by Congress to allow small communities access to technical expertise that is available to most all larger communities. A typical on-site contact could include ensuring the water service is protected and secure, discovering and repairing a faulty chlorination system, assisting a community to remove and replace the filtration media, training a new operator to run that particular treatment system, finding engineering and construction errors in a new sewer system, solving lead and copper rule problems, or completing all the paperwork for funding programs, including the state revolving funds. Often this means being available to travel to the communities on nights, weekends, and during disasters when the problem occurs. Each community's water infrastructure is unique, which means technical assistance must be available to address that community's particular problem. Regarding the Grassroots Rural and Small Community Water Systems Assistance Act, small and rural communities urged the subcommittee to approve the bill for the following reasons. The EPA appropriation bill directs about 0.5% of the agency's internal budget to drinking water technical assistance. Of the billions of dollars provided to EPA by Congress each year, small rural communities would tell you they see and feel the most benefit from the dollars provided to on-site technical assistance. The bill reauthorizes the Safe Drinking Water Act technical assistance provision and mandates that EPA target congressional funding for the most beneficial assistance to small and rural communities. The preference provision in the bill ensures EPA will follow congressional intent in administration of the appropriations. This provision would make implementing the program easier for EPA by providing greater clarity of the intent of Congress to require EPA to ask each technical assistance provider competing for the funding to simply demonstrate to what extent community water systems find their proposal to be the most beneficial and effective. Small and rural communities are very hopeful the bill can be enacted in the remaining weeks of this congressional session and be operative in this appropriation cycle. Currently, the small and rural communities are struggling under new federal regulations, complex funding program applications, and continuing mandatory operator training requirements. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee and discuss this very important public health issue for small rural communities. I would be happy to entertain any questions from the subcommittees. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayfield. And now I'll turn to Robert Stewart, Executive Director of Rural Community Assistance Partnership Incorporated. I think you were here a couple months ago. It's great to have you back, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I really appreciate the opportunity to come back, and Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko and members of the committee, it really is a pleasure to be here to talk to you about this subject. I think what we've heard already is laid a great foundation sort of describing what the problem is. But, you know, I'm here to testify in support of any efforts, including this legislation, that can increase the availability of technical assistance and training for small community water systems that is provided by those nonprofit organizations best suited to provide this assistance, that have staff on the ground in every state, and that is directed at meeting the most critical needs of small communities in regard to regulatory compliance, financial, managerial, and technical sustainability. My name again is Robert Stewart. I'm with the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, which is a national organization, been around 40 years, working with a couple thousand rural communities every year, primarily on water and wastewater issues, as well as solid waste, affordable housing, and economic development issues. Section 1442E of the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments of 1996 were meant to help small communities comply with the increasing regulatory burden that was being placed on them by the Safe Drinking Water Act. Sort of a trade-off of we're going to ask you to comply with additional requirements, and these have been coming down significantly in the last 20 years. In order to comply with these things, we said it was going to be Congress. You all said it was going to be necessary to provide some technical assistance, and that's what 1442E was meant to do and has been we've been working on. And you know, since the expiration of the initial authorization, Congress has continued to fund this program, which we're very much appreciative of. The thousands of small communities that rely on this technical assistance are appreciative of. You know, I might point out that it's been somewhat distressing to us that EPA has never included this funding within their own budget, and it has fallen on the National Rural Water Association and my organization to come to Congress to sort of have these funds appropriated every year. At the same time, EPA, and Mr. Mayfield was sort of alluding this to a way, but I'll say it more directly, EPA has spent a lot of money on developing a variety of tools and programs that are meant to help small communities, but which I think in large part have been of marginal usefulness to these small communities. You know, one thing I want to talk about, which is I don't think it's probably under discussion here at all, but why, you know, what is the need for on the ground kind of assistance that RCAP and National Rural Water Association provides? You know, we've heard about the lack of staffing. Typically, you have volunteer staff in these small communities, people that might be working part-time. Many times there's a lack of expertise in meeting the kind of regulatory requirements that these systems fall under in regard to the operations and the compliance. There's a real difficulty in accessing the existing financing sources, whether that's through the EPA's state revolving funds or the Rural Development's Water and Environment Program. It requires a lot of sophistication in order to understand that they're there, access those fundings, meet all the requirements, and then carry through a construction project. There's also just a variety of issues just in managing a small water utility. This is just like any other business you might come across, except it exists in a heavily regulated environment. And you combine providing that public service, heavily regulated environment, lack of resources. It's just very difficult for small systems, small community systems, to sort of meet all these requirements without some additional kind of training and technical assistance, such as the legislation that we're considering here provides. The needs are many, as I said before, and I understand the resources are few, and I think anytime we have a chance to direct the resources to where it's needed the most, you're going to see NRWA and RCAP be in support of that, and I think that's what this does. There's a lot of opportunities that we've heard mentioned. I know Mr. Tonko mentioned a couple of these things. You know, regionalization in small communities is something we really need to see. We need to sort of be in a mode of sharing resources and working together. You know, as you all know, there's 56-some thousand community water systems in this country. It's just how many electric utilities are there? You know, I mean, it's hardly any compared to the tens of thousands of small water systems there are. But the needs, again, you know, emergency preparedness, we've heard about these, a drought, training and equipping operators in small systems, budget and rate setting, you know, accessing informational resources. You know, there's just this whole litany of needs that small communities have a real difficult time meeting, whereas when you look at the larger utilities, they'll have professional engineers on staff, CPAs on staff, planners on staff. And in a small utility like Mr. Mayfield was referring to specifically, it's usually one person that has, you know, 10 different jobs, and so it's been really tough. And so I just welcome the opportunity to talk more about this. I'm going to end it here because hopefully y'all have some questions that I can answer, and I'm sure Mr. Mayfield and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Before we get to questions for our witnesses, I would ask unanimous consent that all members of the subcommittee have 5 legislative days to submit an opening statement on this hearing into the record. Also, a written statement from the U.S. EPA on the subject of today's hearing will be included in the record, and a written statement from the American Water Works Association on the subject of this hearing be included in the record if it is submitted to the committee by the end of the week. Without objection, so ordered. And I'll recognize myself 5 minutes to start the questioning. And this is for both of you, and then we'll go Mr. Mayfield, Mr. Stewart. What is the role of technical assistance through the Safe Drinking Water Act in helping you comply with the law and avoid adverse public health impacts?
Our technical assistance through our circuit rider program, we go out and help these systems. It don't matter if it's technical, managerial, or financial. We respond to these systems. And these water systems, these operators look up to us to keep them updated on what the new federal rules and regulations are. So we are constantly doing training, and even on-site training when we go in, we're training them on what the new regulations are and how to meet them.
Mr. Stewart?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the small water systems, when they're faced with the new rules, like there's a revised total coliform rule, which is like unbelievably long and hard to digest. You know, if you have someone that's out there on site that can explain that to them, probably in 10 or 15 minutes, as opposed to spending hours trying to wade through a regulation or call somebody to try to get that information. So I think the technical assistance that's under the Safe Drinking Water Act is meant for compliance purposes. That's the bottom line. One thing I think and this was just mentioned, that I think we need to keep in mind is that compliance is not just a function of being able to operate the system. It's a function of also being able to finance and manage that utility. And sometimes I've had the impression that that has not been EPA's priority. EPA's priority as far as where they're putting the money that you've appropriated has been strictly on the operations and compliance end, and somewhat neglecting the foundation of all utilities, all businesses, and that's to have sustainable management and financing in place.
Great, thank you. How is the uncertainty, which we're living in right now, over funding or use of technical assistance provided under the Safe Drinking Water Act, Section 1442E, affected your organization? Mr. Mayfield?
With Mississippi Rural Water, it has affected us with a reduction of staff. We've had to lay off 2 of our staff members that was funded under this program. But we're trying to keep our services up, but sometimes it's difficult.
Ms. Stewart, you want to add to that?
You're referring to my organization or the...
Well, no, just to the organizations like Mr. Mayfield. What's the observation of the effect on them?
I think what happens is if they don't have this kind of assistance, they're going to fall out of compliance. They're not going to be able to pay their bills. They're not managing their utility correctly. And what does that cause? That causes more problems for the state regulators. And so, I mean, a small investment in technical assistance and outreach that we're talking about here prevents a large amount of money being spent by the states to enforce the rules, you know, send out administrative orders, you know, follow up on that. I mean, it's a whole lot better to spend a little money to sort of keep a system from going out of compliance than it is to get them back into compliance.
Thank you. And my last question for you, Mr. Stewart, do you hope that Senate Bill 611 will streamline the way EPA currently implements Section 1442E of the Safe Drinking Water Act?
My honest answer would be no, and that's just because on reflection of how they've used the money in the past that's been appropriated for this purpose. They've taken a long time to get this money out to the successful people that are competing, which has typically been rural water and RCAP. They've taken typically 1.5 years from the time the appropriations is until the money actually flows to our organizations when we've been successful in competing for this funding. And they've also, and I don't want to repeat what I already said, but there's this emphasis on the money just to go strictly to a compliance operational approach. And not what we really need. They're all the same. It's like a 3-legged stool, right? I mean, if you don't have the operations, you don't have the finance, you don't have the management all together supporting the utility, then it's going to fall.
So, so I think you're saying you would like for this to help streamline the process.
Yes.
Okay.
And excuse me, sir. I think it will. I think it will provide some help and some additional direction, and that's, you know, because it sort of directs, you know, this to be used by nonprofit organizations. For certain purposes and for activities that are supportive and needed by the small communities.
Great, thank you very much. I yield back my time and now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you again, Chair Shimkus, for calling this hearing, and I also want to again thank my colleague, Mr. Harper, for the work that he's done on this important issue. Drinking water systems in every congressional district are facing significant challenges as they work to ensure everyone, even people in small communities, have access to safe drinking water. It seems that every week we read about water supply problems, water main breaks, or other events that disrupt our drinking water supplies and services. Mr. Stewart, much of our drinking water infrastructure is decades old and in need of repair or replacement. That is as true for small communities as for large ones. Your testimony emphasizes the need for technical assistance in applying for funds as well as for dealing with finance and management issues. When small systems need infrastructure repairs or replacement, is it just a matter of not knowing how to access funds, or is there also a need to make additional funding resources available?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, because if you can't access the existing funding, then that funding is going to go to the larger communities. The small communities just have a harder time accessing that funding just because of the requirements associated with those. But I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, you quoted EPA studies. There's been AWWA studies. There's been the engineering organizations have done studies, and it's an unfunded need. We definitely need in this country more money to be invested in water utilities, urban and rural.
Thank you. And how would a small system obtain immediate funding needed for emergency repairs when they experience a major problem with their infrastructure or with their source water?
Well, one thing my organization has done, I know rural water has done some of this as well. We have 6 regions around the country, and 2 of our regions operate a nationwide loan fund. So if somebody needs money within a small amount of time, we've been able to capitalize loan funds from a variety of sources, typically foundations or rural development and other sources, so that if there's like a tank failure, a pump failure, and somebody needs money immediately, it's really hard to go to a community bank and get that kind of funding. So they can come to our revolving loan funds for that funding, and we turn it around in a couple of weeks. Whereas if you try to go to rural development or the SRS, you're looking at months and months and months. It just doesn't work.
Thank you. The technical assistance programs have been funded in the range of $12 to $15 million for a number of years now. This year at, I believe, $12.7 million. There are over 48,000 small systems across our country, and these systems indeed are aging. So it seems to me that while this core funding is useful, inflation alone would suggest that a higher authorization for funding should at least be considered. So I would ask both of our witnesses, both gentlemen, would a more generous funding level enable your organizations to better meet the needs of small utilities?
Yes, very much so it would. You know, we see the funding levels be real competitive when our systems, especially our smaller systems, have to go after the funding, and you got some larger systems out there after the same funding. It's real competitive, and having more funding would be help a whole lot better.
And you point out in your testimony that in addition to technical assistance, small systems also have difficulty getting access to capital. So I assume that loans are not an option for many of these small systems. And with a small rate base, for further increases in water and sewer rates, it isn't a feasible option either. It seems to me we need to provide additional funds to enable these systems to repair and replace older infrastructure. Would you agree?
I agree with that.
And would you support legislation to reauthorize the SRF and increase the funding available?
Yes.
Would greater funding for both the SRF and technical assistance be put to good use in these systems?
Very much so it would.
Both of your organizations offer training and certification programs for small system operators. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I've heard from several of my small water utilities that they're having a difficult time recruiting and retaining people to operate these systems, and that many current operators are approaching retirement age, so the backup supply is of a concern. Are there also workforce issues that we need to be concerned about from your perspective?
We do see that. The aging workforce is, we've seen lots of our operators will be retiring in the near future, and not many young people coming up. And you know, National Rural Water has been looking at it for several years now, how we could recruit more young people into the organization.
Now, do you think perhaps the lack of available pool of trained people, skilled people, interested people might be because we've ignored this issue?
Yes, sir. Sure do.
Okay. Well, look, I appreciate your testimony and your support for the legislation. I hope to continue to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address the other challenges our drinking water systems face, and certainly with your very important input, too. So thank you again for appearing before the subcommittee today. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks to you, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Mayfield, for being here. This is an issue that affects every community in our country. Mr. Mayfield, how many local water associations are part of your organization?
There are 1,250 public utilities in the state of Mississippi, and we have 1,057 of them as our members. Of course, we still go help the ones that's not members, too.
So it's quite a responsibility then, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Sure is.
Would you give maybe a specific example or two of the technical assistance that you provide to those association members?
We'd love to. In the Mississippi Delta, where the poverty is real low, we have a little town called Shaw, Mississippi up there. Shaw, Mississippi's chlorination equipment went down at one time. They could not provide the chlorination or the chlorine into the water, so they just quit putting chlorine into the water. Then their electrical control panels on their wells went down, so they was having to go out there every day and turn the well on, fill the tank up, and just hope it stayed full. And this went on for about 3 months. The primacy agency put them under a boil water notice, and then we finally got the call to go up there. And our circuit rider went in, and it was just something minor that was wrong with the chlorination equipment. He got the chlorination equipment up and going, went over to the wells and tanks and got the electrical control panel going. And then he stayed with them to be sure they could pull some clear water samples, got chlorine in the water. This town was having to buy a bottle of water for their school every day for 3 months there. And this circuit rider come in within just a matter of a few days, had this system back into compliance, up and running.
That's great.
That's just one of the many cases. In Wayne County, near Waynesboro, Mississippi, back last spring when we had a series of storms go through our state, one of our systems had a creek crossing to blow out in a river over there. Well, the operator of this system had cancer and had been sent to Houston for treatment. And so when this creek crossing blowed out, the board members had to take it on their own with what few employees, that really meter readers basically, didn't know where everything was, and they searched for that leak for 2 days. They called our office, and I sent our circuit rider over there. Within about 4 hours, he had the leak found in the creek. But not only did he find the leak, he realized that without their operator there, how desperate they was during this time. He stayed right there with them all day and almost all night till they got the water fixed and back up and running.
That's great. Now, how many circuit riders do you have?
We have 3 circuit riders in Mississippi.
So they're pretty busy folks then, aren't they?
95 to 97% of their time is for calls only now.
Got it.
Working calls.
Got it. Well, why can't state regulators or EPA provide technical assistance for the regulations that they impose on communities?
The primacy agencies, their guys is, their men and women is engineers coming out of college. To be a circuit rider, one of the national's requirements is that you have a minimum of 5 years experience actually out operating a system. Okay. So our circuit riders can go out there and talk to these guys and men and women just like they know everything going on. They have the hands-on experience of getting in that mud hole, fixing that leak, to where these coming out of college does not have that experience. And it gives the operator as well as the circuit rider, they bond a lot closer together being there.
That's great. We had a hearing earlier in the year, and some of your colleagues from Mississippi testified that of all the billions of dollars that Congress provides to the federal agencies for environmental programs, the only technical assistance that small and rural communities see and utilize is the assistance from these on-site circuit riders. Please explain a little more what they meant by that.
When these systems have a problem, we are the first call they make. I know you from Mississippi, and you've saw it advertised on TV. One call, that's all in the water business. That's the rural water. That's the circuit rider. So we are a one-stop shop. If they need technical, managerial, financial help, we go in and help them. We've went in and done rate studies to where these systems have sat there on their rates for years and years and not raised the rates, and go in and help them get the rates at the right level, and then they move forward from there.
You know, we just recognized the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and I know my time is almost up, but just briefly tell what you went through after that and what service you provided to those areas affected after Hurricane Katrina and other hurricanes.
That's a good question. Hurricane Katrina was something that none of us was prepared for, but through the proper training, we was ready for it. Our water, as most of you know, much of the state of Mississippi was devastated by Hurricane Katrina. Within 5 to 6 days, 99% of our water systems was back up and running. And this was due to the help of rural water and those operators having the proper training through this program here, training on how to react when something like this happens. Rural water jumped in, and we got the easy systems up going. Then we moved further south, and we helped systems locate lines, locate leaks, fix leaks. We brought crews in from all over the states and other states, Florida, Louisiana, Arkansas, sent crews in. We stayed with City of Bay, St. Louis, some of the coastal towns for up to 4 to 5 weeks after the Katrina.
Thank you, Mr. Mayfield. I appreciate it. My time is up, but thank you so much for what you do and mean to our state. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said before, the bill before us is a small step forward on drinking water issues by reauthorizing technical assistance for small drinking water systems, and I appreciate our ranking member and chairman for working on this issue. But I think it's unfortunate that we're considering the Senate language instead of similar language authored by Mr. Tonko to reauthorize this program, because some of the terms in the Senate bill are unclear. Hopefully we can use this time to build the legislative history on this bill and clarify the legislation. For example, in Section 4, Paragraph 8 of S611, EPA is instructed to give priority to nonprofit organizations that are the most experienced. Similar language in Mr. Tonko's legislation would have given priority to the most effective organization. I think these terms are intended to be synonymous, and we all agree that the money should go to the most effective organizations. Mr. Mayfield, I wanted to ask you, would you say that the NRWA is effective because of its extensive experience?
Yes, sir. NRWA is a nationwide program, and like I said earlier, all of our people has the minimum of at least 5 years experience working in the field with all these systems. So I think we're very experienced at it.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart, do you agree that RCAP's experience in this area helps your organization be effective?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. But when you're talking about experience and whether or not that experience is effective or not, small utilities need a wide variety of expertise in order to help them. You know, it's not just an operational issue about how to operate. You know, a lot of times they need somebody with a kind of a background in accessing financing sources, budgeting, rate setting, in order to get their financial situation in place. But one thing I think that regardless, you know, I would hope Congress would look upon nonprofit organizations such as RCAP and National Rural Water Association as the best means to provide this assistance, because in part we have people on the ground in every single state. There are other people that have been doing this work who may address a part of the need, but having the people on the ground with the experience and the expertise is the most effective way to do this.
All right, thanks. I'm also concerned that the bill could be interpreted as requiring EPA to conduct surveys in each of the states and territories to measure support for different nonprofits that might receive funds, and this would consume time and resources with little benefit. So, Mr. Stewart, do you believe that EPA should be required to survey water systems in each state to determine which organizations provide the most beneficial services?
I would say not. I think EPA is aware of the organizations that provide the best service, and that having to do a survey would just reinforce what they already know.
You agree, Mr. Mayfield?
I would say not. I would say that should be left up to the organization presenting the proposal to EPA to explain to EPA how they are the most beneficial and provide the evidence.
All right. And the last thing I wanted to ask you is I'm concerned that neither the existing statute nor the bill before us lists specific areas of technical assistance that would qualify for this funding. Can you, I'll ask both of you, give the subcommittee a sense of the range of activities that you carry out with this funding? Each of you, if you would.
Well, it's varied over the years, because what EPA has done is they've separated out a compliance section, a management finance section, a wastewater section, and a private water well owner section. So, and both NRWA and RCAP has gotten different pieces of this funding over the years. On the operational end, it's been very frustrating for me because we're constrained in not being able to provide management and finance assistance that supports the operational needs. So what we have done, it's basically a compliance-driven thing. Like, how do you meet the revised total coliform rule? How do you come into compliance with the groundwater rule? Well, that's all well and good, but if you have like an arsenic problem that you're treating for, there's the only way to come into compliance is to go through a financing arrangement where you're looking for funding to sort of provide the treatment, to get the money to provide the treatment. So that's been my frustrating with the approach that the EPA has used. They obviously take the money that Congress provides, and what they do with that money I don't think always is reflective of the intent of Congress.
Mr. Mayfield?
We provide training and technical assistance, and when we talk about technical assistance, like I said earlier, it's just not about the day-to-day operations and technical assistance. For instance, December 23rd in Marion County, Mississippi, a tornado went through Columbia. I had my people to verify with Columbia they was okay. Columbia come back, told us they was okay, everything was up and good and running. At 2:30 a.m. on Christmas Eve morning, we get a call that the generator at Columbia has went down, and they got the hospital sitting right next to the treatment plant. And they informed me when they called me at 2:30 a.m. that morning that we got 2 hours water supply left for this hospital. What can you do to help us? We jumped into action. And at 4:45 a.m. that morning, we had the generator hooked up and was pumping water. So it's about being there when you're needed, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to have a discussion on this subject, and I'm pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of the legislation that we have. I represent in West Virginia another, just like you, Mr. Mayfield, a rural, impoverished state that struggles. We have the highest rate of unemployment. We have the second lowest per capita income. In my district, I have 2 cities that have 30,000 people. Otherwise, every community is smaller than that. I've got one community that only has 500 people. It's a seasonal community that maybe can grow to 2,000 during the winter. And they had a little problem. Here's a water line that they tried for 10 years to get funds for. And it only has the ability to pass maybe about 22% of the water through that line. But they can't get money. So I applaud this effort to try to get more technical assistance, but I'm wondering if we're chasing the wrong rabbit. I mean, it's good to get this, to get people lined up into the queue to get money, but we got to get the money. We got to have more money at the other end. The state revolving fund has been used as a pawn. And I know in 2013, the president in his budget slashed almost 50% out of the money out of the SRF. And if it weren't for members on the other side of the aisle when working with the Appropriation Committee, we were able to get that money restored. But I don't know whether the administration and other people within the groups actually feel the need for rural America with the problems we have with this, because this was done not with not one dime of federal money. They finally had to get the state to step in because everyone was saying there's just no federal money. We can't do it because you're such a small community. I've got another community that has 75 families that they have to get bottled water. And they've been doing it for 2 years. They get their potable water so that they can flush their toilets out of a creek. These are middle-income people that have homes that are $100 to $150 to $200,000 in value, and they can't sell their home. Who's going to buy a home that doesn't have water to it? So I'm very concerned about this. I want this legislation to pass, but I'm even more so concerned that we are giving false hope to people, get people in the queue to get money, but there's no money because the allocation and the administration or whatever the programs are, they're not funding it into rural communities to be able to help out on that. I know all the words sound right, but in the real world, I think as we live in, small communities aren't getting that money. And so what would you do then to help refocus this so that this administration or any administration can understand the hardship that's occurring on small towns, these little communities of 500 or 1,000 people? What would you do to get more money into that account?
Well, I think that's something that we need to sit down and take a long look at. That the smaller systems gets more, is looked at more, that they can be as competitive as the larger systems are. Let me just.
Would you agree that one of the criteria they always say is, where's your matching money? But a small town of 500 can't come up with that matching money. I've got a community that has to come up with $12.5 million. What are they going to do? They only have 550 customers.
That's right. And there again, at some point in time, that's where consolidation and merging may have to come into the picture when these smaller towns cannot come up with this matching money.
I would say that there is no doubt that the water utilities in this country are underinvested, and it's not just the EPA SRF programs; it's rural development's water and environment programs. They need more funding because you can't have one without the other. You need the technical assistance. One thing, for EPA's credit and rural development also, is that they've been stressing, just like our two organizations have for 40 years, asset management. How do you take care of the equipment, the facilities that you have? And so EPA has been pushing on that. Both of our organizations have been putting on that to sort of, maintain that investment, once it's actually made. But if you don't make the investment, and as we know, this country is still growing, and there's still needs that haven't been met. There's people in your state and in many other states that don't even have community water systems that are hauling water. And without that kind of investment, those people are never going to get community water systems. So I think both NRWA and RCAP, I can't speak for NRWA, RCAP definitely supports some increased funding for the SRF programs and the water environment program.
Well, I've run out of time, but can you just give me an idea what kind of money should we be spending, knowing that the SRF is just one amount and there are other sources? What kind of money should we be spending annually?
That's a tough one because, as we've heard, the needs are so great. The needs are in the trillions. An incremental increase, even if it was just 10% a year in each of those two programs, something to start making a dent in the backlog that we've seen. Anything would help.
You would agree?
I totally agree.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling the hearing as part of the subcommittee's ongoing work on drinking water issues. Safe drinking water is a serious issue in our district, as it is likely for every member of the subcommittee. Small and rural water systems face a number of very serious challenges and not have the customer base to finance serious infrastructure repairs they need. Customers of public water systems in the country should be able to count on safety of the water coming out of their taps, whether they live in a rural area, cities, or suburbs. My question to the panelists, first of all, I have a very urban area, but I also represent an unincorporated area that will not be annexed by our major cities because the property wealth is so low. It would cost more to serve those areas with streets and water and sewer than it is so they're actually hemmed in by cities. And we've been able in the past to use assistance with matching funds to be able to bring down some of for even very small urban water systems. How can consolidation help small and rural water systems? For example, in whether it be a rural area like Mississippi or even an urban area like I have.
You get a more customer base, therefore you keep the rates as low as you can, and more customers out there can help pay those loans and grants that you receive. I'd like to, if I could, just step back just a quick second on technical assistance. When we're talking about technical assistance, one thing that's real good about our technical assistance providers, these men and women stay up on the latest technology out there. And when these towns, like you're talking about, does go for loans and grants, the engineer gives them a preliminary engineering report. Lots of times our circuit riders can sit down with these towns and look at this preliminary engineering report and say, look, there's a cheaper and better way to do it. Yeah. So we need to get these technical assistance providers working with these towns and cities on a case-by-case basis when it comes to these loans and grants.
Okay.
Mr. Rennie, if I could just make a comment, since Texas is my home state, as you know, it's water availability is a big issue in Texas, and if you have small communities that can come together and that can access either surface or groundwater, I mean, you have a much better chance of doing that. And we've always tried to get the cities, even if you're not annexing, you can perhaps provide wholesale water or just do water and wastewater service in those areas by extending their CCNs.
Well, our situation, we've done that. City of Houston's been able, but of course you have to bring money to the table to make sure the city taxpayers are not doing it, but they would sell the water. Of course, in our area, we still use groundwater, but mostly it's surface water because of subsidence for the last 60 years and in the flooding issues. Ms. Stewart, when you testified before the subcommittee in February, you mentioned several alternative service delivery approaches, including sharing service, cooperative operations, and management and consolidation. How can these alternatives approaches help small systems achieve better compliance? Is there some bureaucratic rule that you can't do it, or is it just a matter of...
No, I think it's a matter of having somebody that's facilitating getting multiple communities to work together, so that maybe if you have 2 or 3 communities that are close enough and they can share an operator instead of hiring their own, But sometimes, even though water systems are pretty good about knowing what's going on in their counties and stuff, if you have somebody that can sort of facilitate those kind of sharing of service arrangements, I think that can make a big difference.
Okay. Last Congress, our subcommittee introduced legislation, the Aqua Act, that would expand the definition of restricting for the SRF, the State Revolving Fund Program, to explicitly include cooperative partnerships and joint purchasing agreements and consolidation. Mr. Stewart, would you support that change?
Yes, very much so, yes.
And again, in Texas, there are challenges confronting water systems in my own state that are unique compared to other states, although I would compare some of my rural areas in East Texas with Mississippi, same problems. Are there differences and challenges confronting rural water systems and small systems in urbanized areas like they're found in my North and East Houston, Harris County area between a rural system and an urban system?
Well, the economies of scale, like Mr. Mayfield and a couple of have mentioned, are one issue. Part of the problem with small communities is just can be availability of water, as you know. I mean, I know in the Houston area, you're getting off groundwater and going to surface water, which is necessary. But
and most of the surface water we're getting is owned by the city of Houston, by the way.
Right. Yes. So you're just at I hate to say, a competitive disadvantage if you're a small system and you're looking for water rights or for access to groundwater resources. You're just at a disadvantage, no doubt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the testimony and our witnesses.
Gentleman yields back his time. We're waiting for Mr. McNerney to rapidly get here. What I would like to just mention, it without objection, is just talk about our push in Southern Illinois to really encourage a lot of systems to move into a regional system, rural water, USDA rural water. It's been very successful because what I've observed is older systems, new regulations, small community, small rate base, as all the things that have been mentioned here, there's no ability to borrow the money, pay the rates, and so only through encouraging over time, respectfully, that most of my areas, we're starting to close the gaps in systems, so that the important thing is to make sure that we have clean, potable water for my constituents and stuff, and it's been a very, very successful program that we've worked on. It's very gratifying. It's been one of the things that I've been most proud of. That's kind of an untold story, is when you can get safe drinking water to people who really haven't had it or have had to haul it for time. So I'm filibustering. Anyone want to add that? We've kind of talked about it, Mr. Stewart.
Well, yeah. Again, I think that in support of technical assistance, in order to facilitate regionalization, you need somebody on the ground that can work with multiple communities, that knows all about the finance management and technical aspects of it, and that can think about different opportunities for communities to work together. Because as you know, Chairman, this is not necessarily a physical consolidation. Maybe it's a managerial consolidation over multiple satellite systems. Again, for lack of a better word, there's more efficiencies. But if you're operating a small system and you're just trying to make the water come out of the pipe every day, you have a hard time looking forward, a year in advance of what you need to be doing.
Thank you very much. And I think the chair is going to recognize my colleague and friend, obviously, since I waited for him, the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for your patience, and I thank the witnesses. Mr. Mayfield, it sounds like the circuit rider is a pretty interesting job. You get to go around and see different things just about every day.
New experience every day.
Is that, but that is a state-funded organization. You don't get any money from the federal government about that.
We do get some money from USDA for the circuit rider.
So that's helpful then, but this proposed legislation would help that then.
That's correct.
Good. Mr. Stewart, I get the impression that you feel the EPA is well-meaning in terms of its new regulations. It's going to make water safer, and in fact, also well-meaning in terms of trying to provide assistance. But they kind of missed the mark in their attention. Is that right?
Yes, sir. I believe that they could be better. They could better direct the kind of resources for where the needs are the greatest.
Would the proposed legislation help?
I think this is a great first step in that direction.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart, would planning and adapting to drought and other emergencies related to climate change be an acceptable technical assistance under current statute?
Yes, it is, because I know both Rural Water and RCAP are working with you. We work with quite a few systems in the Central Valley of California that are having issues. Some that are actually still considered colonias in Riverside County, and they have not only drought issues, but as you know, arsenic issues, just water quality issues. So yes, I mean that is an acceptable use for the funding currently.
All right, and the current legislation wouldn't change that?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, good. Mr. Mayfield, do you agree that the current statute protects you for planning for climate change or adapting to climate change?
Yes, I agree with that.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief here. Mr. Stewart, do you think the bill would restrict your ability to offer technical assistance in moving drinking water intakes or finding alternative source water?
No, I think that's. I think when you're talking about compliance, you're talking not only the quality, but availability and quantity. So I think yes, I think that's all. We've never been told that wouldn't be an acceptable use of the technical assistance money.
Is identifying and mitigating contamination acceptable technical assistance under current law?
Well, that's more of a source water protection kind of an issue that EPA has at times in the past funded separately. That's it's eligible, but that's not really what. If you look at the RFAs that come out from EPA for this purposes, that's not what their emphasis has been. I would say that.
Would the new bill change that, in your opinion?
See, I'm not sure. That's for y'all to decide. I mean, you know, what you direct EPA to do and then what they do can be two different things, and I'm not the one to decide, you know, who's right and who's right on that.
The chairman's smiling on this.
That's for y'all to do, right? That's
Mr. Mayfield, do you offer training to monitor for and mitigate contamination? Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
That sounds like most of the time you're just reacting to crises, but you actually have some amount of resources to deploy in terms of training as well?
Yes, sir. Before the money started getting cut through EPA, Mississippi had two, like Mr. Stewart was talking about, source water people on staff that was out in the field every day dealing with this type of problems. But, you know, when the funding got cut, though, we had to lay those two people off. But we still do it through training.
Thank you. Well, I think the assistance is very important. It will only become more so as climate change exacerbates the problems of our drinking water sources. So I hope we can continue to work together on these problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Maybe I shouldn't have waited, but no, I'm glad I did. So with that, seeing no other member wishing to ask questions, we want to thank you all for traveling and spending time with us. We look forward to kind of moving promptly to try to get this through our system, get it to the floor, so hopefully we can meet the time schedules that we all know that we need to meet. So with that, I'll call the hearing adjourned.
Tommy said to make sure.